Jehovah Jireh, God my provider. My provider? Wait a minute. Almost daily on the news, we hear of Christians who are being persecuted, tortured, even beheaded for their faith. Is this an example of God's provision for us? What about earthquakes, tsunamis, and typhoons? Masses of people have suffered from what we glibly call acts of God. Surely we can't believe that people who are maimed or killed by natural disasters just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time? Did God simply forget that they were there when He brought on the wind and the waves and the shaking earth? Perhaps the greatest challenge apologists face from unbelievers is to provide persuasive answers to these questions. I've heard simplistic responses that suggest that if Christians were serving God as He intends, they would not be exposed to these kinds of violence. But would you say that the apostles had not been performing God's will when they were tortured and murdered for sharing the gospel? As long as humanity enjoys the benefits of free will, we will also suffer its violence. In a recent article in Vanity Fair, Desmond Tutu challenged those who would accuse God of ambivalence. The subject of the article is Bryan Stevenson, the man who founded the Equal Justice Initiative in order to provide justice for minorities. Quote, "You might assume God is not paying attention, but God does not use strong-arm tactics to ensure that justice is done, nor directly intervene to stop injustice. God empowers us to identify the path of righteousness." Note 24. I don't have a convincing argument for doubters, but I'm fully convinced that God has and always will provide me with what He knows I need in order to fulfill His will. I've never liked how the story of Abraham's sacrifice begins. It makes no sense to me. Did God really tell Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? We know that child sacrifice was a common practice for this era. This explains why Abraham was willing to consider the idea. But did Jehovah condone it? All I can say is that God meets us wherever we are. I don't believe He would ever expect me to do something against His precepts. But perhaps He would use my own cultural understanding to put me in the place He wants me to be. After all, God did not allow Abraham to actually follow through with the human sacrifice. There may be times when God inspires us to take an action that puts us in the place where He wants us to be, only to have us change the strategy once we are where we belong. God had promised that nations would be created through Abraham's son, from Genesis 17:16. Abraham's tremendous faith in God permitted him to obey this most unthinkable directive that seemingly would destroy a nation before it had even begun. The ram caught up in the thicket was provided as a replacement for the sacrifice that Abraham so willingly brought to God. Jehovah provided the very thing that Abraham needed to fulfill His will. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." Genesis 22:14. When I followed God's direction and find myself in a dangerous place, God will provide whatever it is that I need to stay in His will. Note 25. God sees to all our needs, but we must not confuse selfish desires with necessities. In times of testing, God may call us to let go of our attachment to material things in order to reveal some genuine need. When our finances overwhelm us, we might think we need more money, while God is revealing our need to trust Him in times of poverty. In Matthew 6:33 we read, "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well." There are many books written about people who have risked everything from material possessions to their very lives because they trusted in God's provision. People like Corrie ten Boom, George Mueller, Francis A. Schaeffer, and many others. Reading about their experiences can encourage us to trust God in every detail of our circumstances. Note 26. In her book La Brie, Edith Schaefer recalls the disappointment her family experienced at learning that they were to be ejected from Switzerland due to their religious influence on the people of the community. Note 27. What follows is a marvelous tale of God's provision in a hostile environment. Our lives may be much simpler than the impressive ministry granted the Schaefers, but don't be misled. Simplicity does not imply insignificance. Consider the lilies. The humblest servant is as important to God as the most prominent leader. Does this mean that God cares only about his family of Christians? There is an interpretation of Hagar's exile from Abraham's camp that is often overlooked. Sarah sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness after Ishmael had mocked Isaac. Even though Hagar's child's existence was the result of Sarah's unbelief and Abraham's complicity, God provided for Ishmael and Hagar. See Genesis 21:17 through 21. In addition, the provision of God for Gentiles can be lost in the melodramatic story of Jonah being swallowed by a great fish. God showed his love for the Gentile nation of Nineveh by providing his prophet to call them into relationship. We must realize that praying for provision must be accompanied by the expectation that only God knows what it is that we truly need. As we pray in this way, we can be confident that God will not only answer our prayer, but will reveal to us what we should be praying for. Note 28. As we see God work his miracle of provision, we learn more and more of his deep love for us, his beloved children. Are you confident that God is providing what you need, even when it's not what you ask for?